Good morning. This is Kristen at UT Southwestern Medical Center. Thank you so much for joining us for our Facebook Live chat with Dr. Ted Laetsch about pediatric cancer treatments and research. Dr. Laetsch sees patients, and he also leads the experimental therapeutics program at the Gill Center for Cancer and Blood Disorders at Children's Health, which is our partner institution. And on the research side, he looks at, from both the clinical and the laboratory fronts, on testing potential novel therapeutics in high-risk pediatric solid tumors. So we're very excited to have Dr. Laetsch here today. A couple reminders: don't forget to like and share the conversation. We want to spread this far and wide, as well as ask your questions in the comments field. We have about 30 minutes, so we'll take as many as we can get to. And special thanks to both Moncrief Cancer Institute and the 1 Million for Anna Foundation on their support. One final reminder is, remember, Dr. Laetsch cannot answer specific patient questions. We can talk in generalities, but we want to be mindful that we don't provide information that we're not able to do so in this format. So let's go ahead and get started. Dr. Laetsch,
Great.
It's wonderful to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So there was a paper that went out recently, just to kind of get us started, that talked about Larotrectinib and some recent findings that you had. Could you kind of go over what those findings were and why it's meaningful?
Sure. So we published a paper describing the pediatric phase 1 study of Larotrectinib, which means the first study of Larotrectinib in children. And what we found was that actually every patient whose tumor had a fusion of a specific gene, a specific genetic mutation in the cancer called the TRK fusion, had their tumor shrink with this therapy, and 93% of them had an objective response, so a significant amount of tumor shrinkage.
Mm-hmm. And what does that mean in the long term? I understand it was a phase 1 clinical trial. What else needs to happen?
So ongoing follow-up of those patients is still going on that study, and one of the other remarkable things was that in addition to just having so many patients whose tumors shrunk, all except one of those patients whose tumors shrunk with this therapy, with a TRK fusion, have continued to respond to the therapy and continue to be treated with it.
Okay.
And so it's really, we're gaining more information about how long those responses can last, but so far they seem to last for a very long time.
That's exciting. So what exactly is that drug, and what effects does it have on treatment, particularly with kids?
Yeah, so Larotrectinib is what's called a TRK inhibitor. It's a drug that blocks a specific signaling pathway inside your cell. So it works very different than the other chemotherapy you may think of that makes your hair fall out or have mouth sores or other low blood counts. It works by trying to block a signaling pathway within a cell, which is abnormally turned on by a mutation in their cancer, a mutation in the DNA of their cancer. And that specific mutation is called the TRK fusion. Okay,
perfect. So we've got some questions that are starting to come in. This one is one of the questions I was going to ask next, actually. And it's, how do you determine who is a candidate for this treatment?
So really what we've seen is that Larotrectinib has been remarkably active across all different types of cancer in patients with a TRK fusion. So it really is that genetic mutation that identifies who I would recommend consider this therapy. And so that is something that we can test by a variety of different ways, but really genetic testing of the tumor is what we need to identify those patients.
Gotcha. Okay, great question. Thanks for asking it. So here we have one from Dawn, and Dawn asks, what types of cancer can Larotrectinib be used on? Is there a specific one, or is it a little bit more general?
So in pediatrics, most of the patients who had TRK fusions have had various types of sarcomas. But there's other cancers that have also been treated, including children with brain tumors and children with thyroid cancer. In adults, actually, it's been very broad, the number of tumors that have been found to have TRK fusions, and include things that are very common, like breast cancer and lung cancer and colon cancer, pancreatic cancer. But it's a small percentage of patients with each of those cancers that have the specific mutation. So it really is about identifying that genetic change in the cancer rather than a specific type of cancer.
Gotcha. So are you also involved in adult trials, or you focus exclusively on pediatrics?
So my role is really a pediatric oncologist, but the way Larotrectinib has been developed has been an analysis of all patients, both children and adults, and so we recently published that analysis in the New England Journal of Medicine in February, and that demonstrated an 80% response rate across children and adults with TRK fusion positive cancers.
Wow, that's amazing. That's why it's gained so much attention. So we have one here from Christy. And we just touched on this a little bit, but Christy asks, does this treatment work for adults as well as children?
So it does. I think we should sort of address that question. But there were 55 patients reported in the New England Journal of Medicine article, children and adults. 12 of those patients were children, and the rest, 43, were adults. And we saw an 80% response rate across the age range.
Okay.
So really, it seems to be independent of both what type of cancer you have and your age. Really, if you have this TRK fusion, the chances that you'll respond to this drug seem to be very high.
Okay, that's good news for some people.
Yeah.
So we've got these, we have a lot of questions coming in. This is great. So here's one from Charlene, and she asks, once the drug shrinks the tumor, can it then be surgically removed? And if the cancer hasn't spread, can the patient be considered in remission?
So yes, certainly we would consider the patient in remission if it can be surgically resected.
Okay.
A couple of the patients in the pediatric phase 1 study actually were able to do just that, that their tumors shrunk enough with this therapy that the surgeons were able to take out the tumor, and when they looked at that, they didn't see any tumor that was left behind. And both of those patients were able to then stop the drug and be observed, and so far it's been over 6 months and neither of those patients has had recurrence of their tumor.
Wow, that's phenomenal.
Yeah.
I'm a little stunned by that. That's amazing.
So we're hopeful. I think it's still early, to know whether or not those tumors could come back, but so far it's been very promising that this may be able to enable curative surgery in some patients. And in other patients, actually, the tumors completely shrank and went away, so there's no visible tumor that we can see.
Wow, so they didn't have to do surgery, or it just disappeared?
It completely shrunk. And those patients have continued on treatment so far. One of the things we're still thinking about is how long do you need to treat those patients for, and we don't know that answer yet. That's something that we need to work on. But some patients appear to go into remission even with just the drug alone.
That's fascinating. So we've got another question here. This one's from Heather. And this was one that I wanted to ask you that's kind of unrelated to this particular topic, but just what kind of advice do you have for families who have children that are going through cancer treatments and may or may not be involved in this particular effort?
Yeah, I think that's a very difficult time for many patients, and I think many different advice I could give, but I think seeking support and through foundations and through other support groups is really helpful to connect with other families that have been through what you're going through. Because I can provide some support, but I've never been the parent of a child with cancer, and connecting with friends and people that have gone through that, both for you and for your children, I think can be very helpful.
Yeah, it was a really good question, Heather. Thank you for sharing it. I know it touches a lot of people. Here's a different one from Lori. And speaking of, what we're talking about with Larotrectinib, is this a new direction for pediatric cancer treatment? Is it part of a larger move towards a cure?
So I think this is a big step in sort of the next direction of cancer treatment. We talked a little bit about how previous chemotherapy worked in a different way,
right.
And then over the last 10 to 20 years, we've developed new medicines that are trying to block specific mutations in cancer. One of them, imatinib, was sort of the first on the market and helped a lot of patients with CML, blocking a mutation in their cancer. And I think of this as sort of the next step, where now we're not blocking just a mutation in a particular type of cancer, but now we're blocking a mutation across a number of different cancers, and trying to target the cancer therapy in a different way.
So what is, with that part, what effects are there side effects to this drug when it's involved in treatment? I read the news release that went out from us, and it sounded like that particular individual didn't experience many. Is that common?
It's been very well tolerated. So this drug is a very selective blocker of those specific fusions, those specific proteins called the NTRK genes. And so certainly there are side effects with every therapy,
right, of course.
But it's been very well tolerated. The most common things we've seen are sort of mildly low blood counts and mild changes in blood tests. But most patients, like our patient, have had few side effects that they felt and have felt very well on this therapy.
Okay, good to know. So let's see, we've got a couple here. I'm going to figure out which one we can take right now. So here's one that appeared on our event page, and it's similar to Heather's question, and it's how hopeful should parents of children that have cancer be about this drug? It sounds like it's good for a very select group.
I think we're working on a lot of different therapies for different types of cancer. I think this drug is a major advance for those patients who have TRK fusions. Unfortunately, we also learned that it doesn't seem to work in patients who don't have TRK fusions. And so, but that doesn't mean that I wouldn't consider this another advance and another step in sort of targeting cancer more precisely, and we hope that there are many more of these kind of discoveries down the road.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that question. So I want to take a minute and let people know that we're almost halfway through already, so now is a great time to keep sending those questions. We are going to take as many as we can, and I know we've got some viewers from 1 Million for Anna Foundation and also Moncrief, so feel free to share your questions as well. You know, one of the next questions we have is related to what we were just talking about, and it's from Lori, and it says, no wait, now I just lost it. I had it from Lori. Here it is. How long will it take to determine the long-term side effects of this treatment? Is that a decade-long process, 5 or 6 years?
So we're continuing to follow the patients on the trial. And watching for that. I think, you know, we can't know the side effects until they would have occurred. So, but most of the time, within a few years, we'll be able to tell whether or not we expect many long-term side effects from this therapy. So, 5 years or so.
5 years. That's relatively short time period for some of the studies. So that's helpful. So thank you, Lori, for that question. And here we have one from the 1 Million for Anna Foundation, which we've mentioned a couple times. And they're saying, the question is, so many children needed to be treated as quickly as possible. How quickly can you determine if a patient is eligible for this treatment, and how quickly can it be put into use?
So that really depends on the testing we need to do to find the mutation. And so for some patients with some types of cancer, we can do very quick testing that can identify these TRK fusions. Sometimes that's even overnight testing that can identify these TRK fusions. For other children, we need to do bigger sort of sequencing tests, and those usually take 2 to 3 weeks to get results back. So it depends a little bit on the patient, but in general, we're able to get the results in that time frame. Currently, it's still only available through a clinical trial, which means it's an investigational medicine. And so you would need to be treated at a site that has the study available. But when the study's available at the site, patients can be treated very quickly, the same day or the next day, if we need to.
Wow, and I know we're a site here at the Children's Health, UT Southwestern. Are there other sites in Texas that you're aware of?
There are not other sites for this drug, this study in Texas. It's open at a number of sites across the United States and across the world, actually, but we're the only site in Texas.
Okay, good to know. Well, thank you very much, 1 Million for Anna. It's a great question. We've got another one from Christy, which gets back to that similar topic. How long does treatment typically last for this drug? And do patients have to be in a certain stage to be eligible for this?
So how long does treatment usually last? We don't actually know the answer to that question yet. As I mentioned, there's a couple of patients who've had their tumors shrink enough to have surgery and we're able to stop. Almost all the rest of the patients are still getting treated, and we don't know how long that is. It's different. We think about it differently than we think about sort of chemotherapy, which maybe we give you 6 months of chemotherapy and stop. We don't actually know how long you need this therapy, whether you need it for the rest of your life. It's a pill that's taken twice a day, so it's something that you can take chronically, but it may be different than sort of standard chemotherapy.
Okay, so it sounds like something that would be easier for patients in the long run. You don't have to come here, you don't have or chemotherapy and.
So in general, you don't need a central line, so you don't need a port or a catheter like you need for chemotherapy. It's a medicine that's taken at home, just orally twice a day, so it's pretty easy to take from that standpoint. Our patients who get it, who are on it for a long term, they come back once a month for a checkup with the physician and for laboratory tests, and then every few months they have scans of their tumor. But most of the time they're at home and they're able to go to school. And
that's fantastic for those families.
Yeah.
That's great. So what about, we talked a lot about this type of drug. I mean, what type of tests, and this is a different one from Charlene, determine whether a patient actually has this fusion that you're talking about? Is that a typical genetic test? Is it something that you do in the office visit?
So it's a genetic test, and there's, as I mentioned, a few different ways of doing that genetic test. So for some tumors, there's a specific test called a FISH, which is a genetic test when you think you know exactly what the fusion might be. For other tumors, there's a variety of different types of fusions, and those are what we call next-generation sequencing tests, or tests where they look at many different genes in your tumor to identify mutations, and they may identify this mutation that could predispose you to being sensitive to this drug. They may identify a mutation that could predispose you to being sensitive to a different drug. And that's a next-generation sequencing test that is available at a number of different places across the country. We're also studying the ability to use faster tests, because we agree that being able to identify patients quickly is very important. So there are some pathology tests that could be done just in a laboratory overnight that may be able to predict who might have one of those fusions, but those are still in development.
There's a lot happening. So here's a different question that's about all that happening. And Heather came back and asked, can you give us an idea of the time frame trajectory of this drug research from like the bench to the bedside? It sounds like it's been quite a journey.
This drug has been very fast. So the first adult patient who had one of these TRK fusions was treated with this drug just over 3 years ago. And the first pediatric patient was treated just over 2 years ago. So one of the things that's been very fast about this drug is that timeline from the first adult to the first child. Oftentimes that's many years between when those patients are treated, but in this drug it was only 9 months. And then the other thing that's been very fast is the development from the time the first people were treated to getting the drug submitted to the FDA. So this drug has now been submitted to the FDA, and they're reviewing the application for approval of the therapy. But that timeline of 3 years from the time the first patient with the targeted mutation was treated to FDA submission is very fast.
Wow, that we don't hear that very often. So I'm wondering, if granted, we have lots of different people from different walks of life watching this. Are there things that they can do to help with this research? Are there organizations that you work with? Are there things they can do from a political government perspective?
So I think a number of different things have been very helpful. So there, in general, have been efforts recently to encourage research in pediatric cancer, and those have been both sort of like sticks and carrots that have been applied to companies that are studying drugs and for children, to try to encourage them to study drugs for children with cancer, even though there may not be the potential for big profits because there's not as many children with cancer as there are for adults. There's still obviously a big need for our patients. So those kind of advocacy things can help. And then, of course, it takes a big team to do all this research, and so I have a team of research coordinators and support staff who help with all these studies, and those people are supported by donations to Children's Medical Center and to UT Southwestern and to other foundations that support cancer research, and those are much appreciated, of course.
Good to know. So, we've talked a lot about this particular trial. Given that your role at Children's particularly, I'm curious kind of what else do you see on the horizon? Like, what other things is your team or others are they investigating that looks like it might have some promise?
The other thing we've been investigating a lot recently has been CAR T cells for leukemia patients. So those are a way of taking your immune system and teaching it to fight your cancer. So another way of targeting your cancer, different than standard chemotherapy, but also very different than Larotrectinib that we've been talking about. And we've also just published recently the success of that research where CAR T cells also induced remission in just over 80% of children who had refractory leukemia, and were FDA approved last year for children with relapsed or refractory leukemia.
That's amazing. So how does that work? I mean, we talked a little bit about how this works. What happens with the CAR T process?
So with CAR T cells, we actually take out a normal part of your immune system called your T cells that normally fight infection, and we engineer those in the laboratory to be able to attack your specific cancer. So those are then given back to you, and they're a live, living cell that then can grow, and just like a response to an infection, can actually start to attack and kill your cancer cells. And then in some cases, those cells can last for a very long time in your body, and we think prevent relapse of your cancer.
And is that specific to leukemia, or is it kind of, can you use it across different types of cancer?
So the type of CAR T cells we've been using so far attacks a specific protein on the surface of cells.
Okay.
And that protein is on the surface of B cells. So it's been studied for pediatric leukemia as well as lymphomas in both adults and children, other B cell cancers. Theoretically, we can change that to attack any protein we want.
Right.
And so there are ongoing research studies in other cancers to look and see whether or not CAR T cells may be as efficacious as they are in leukemia.
Okay, good to know. So good timing. We've got a question in from Carol, and she says, could you share some hope with those of us looking for better treatment and an improved cure rate for Ewing sarcoma?
So I think one of the lessons that we've learned from Larotrectinib is that if you're able to target the fusion that drives the cancer, you can see remarkable effects. And so Ewing sarcoma is a cancer where there's a specific fusion called EWS-FLI that drives that cancer. And Larotrectinib won't block that fusion, to be clear. But I think the lesson we've learned from the TRAC fusion cancers is that if you can block that fusion, you can really change the game. And so I'm hopeful that in the future we'll be able to figure out how to target that EWS-FLI fusion, and that may really change the game for kids with Ewing sarcoma.
Wow, thank you for the question, Carol. That was really great. I'm curious, with both of these treatments, I mean, that you're looking at, both CAR T and with Larotrectinib, like, what happens if it doesn't work? Are there other options still on the horizon that somebody might be able to consider?
So there are. Certainly for Larotrectinib, actually, one of the other remarkable things about that drug is that a next generation TREC inhibitor was developed almost at the same time as Larotrectinib.
Okay.
And it's called LOXO-195, and it can actually block some of the ways that cells become resistant to Larotrectinib. And so in fact, the first two patients who had their tumors progress on Larotrectinib or became resistant to Larotrectinib got treated with LOXO-195, and both of them again had their tumors shrink with LOXO-195. So I think we are continuing to do research to help those patients where that doesn't work. And the same for CAR T cells. We're looking at different CAR T cells that attack different targets on the surface of leukemia, or other drugs that attack different surface proteins on leukemia, to try to continue to improve outcomes for patients.
Good to know. All right, I want to remind everybody, we only have about 5 minutes left. I know this has gone really fast, but I want to encourage you to put those last minute questions in. I know Dr. Laetsch has got to get back to seeing patients, so we have a couple more that came through, and this one is, what's the best way to find out about clinical trials for your child? Is that something that should come from your physician, or are there other alternatives?
So I always encourage patients to talk with their physician, because there are many clinical trials out there, and some of them may be better or not so good for each individual patient. There are also resources out there for you to look yourself. So clinicaltrials.gov is one really good resource that lists all the clinical trials that are open in the United States. And so I think many of my patients will come to me with printouts from clinicaltrials.gov and say, what about this trial or that trial? But I think doing that in collaboration with your physician is important, because they really understand the clinical trials and your cancer, and can help you navigate that space, because there are oftentimes many options available.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was curious about that. If you experienced that, where we all Google our conditions, and I don't know about this. Is this accurate? So thank you for that resource. We'll be able to share the clinicaltrials.gov link and some others in the stream if you're following along. So what about, where else do you see pediatric cancer treatments going? I mean, are there any things where, like I know with some forms of breast cancer, they're looking at, you go in once, you have a dose of radiation, you go home and you're done. Is that even on the table for kids, something like that?
I think there's a number of different treatments. We aren't exploring that one necessarily quite as much, but I think from a radiation standpoint, proton therapy has been able to reduce the amount of radiation that your normal tissues get when you need radiation for your cancer, and especially for children, many of whom we hope will live 70 or 80 years after they're diagnosed with cancer. We hope that can reduce the long-term side effects of that radiation therapy. So developments like that, people are spending a lot of effort looking at immunotherapy, like the CAR T cells, but not just for leukemia, for a variety of cancers, solid tumors as well as leukemia and lymphoma. And we're continuing to explore other targeted therapies like Larotrectinib to try to increase the number of patients that we can help with those kind of treatments.
Okay. So I'm just I'm curious, and several other people have commented on this. What inspires you? What gives you hope in terms of what you do on a day-to-day basis?
So it's the patients, of course, right? So, I think getting to see patients, some of whom we don't think would have been able to do well with standard therapy, who are years later doing wonderfully after participating in one of these research studies, is really inspires me, and I just can't get enough of getting to see those kids and their families.
That's perfect. And I think that's a perfect way to end our chat. We're out of time. We want to thank everybody for tuning in and all of the questions. They've been fantastic. Don't forget, this chat will be available here on Facebook, so if you didn't get a chance to watch all of it, if you want to come back and watch it later, you can. It'll also be on our UT Southwestern YouTube channel, and we'll be sure to share that link later. Thanks again to Moncrief for helping promote this chat, as well as the 1 Million for Anna Foundation. We really appreciate your collaboration, and of course we wouldn't be here without Children's Health and Dr. Laetsch. So thank you very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Well, thank you for having me.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.